Um, Good morning, everyone. So my name is John Gitao, and it says there for John Walubengo because Walubengo was actually supposed to come and make this presentation. But I've worked with him extensively, and I'll give some background around why we're looking at blockchain and what it is we are trying to achieve with blockchain. So as previously said, my name is John Gitao. I work at Cisco Systems as part of the global service providers team. When we basically support quite a number of service providers selling technologies and assisting you get the best of it. Anyway, so why are we here? So sometime, I think 6 months ago or 4, I can't remember which, in Kenya specifically, we came up with a task force to look at these two technologies, blockchain and AI. And the task force was tasked with several things, but key among them was to look at how these particular technologies will influence future technologies, future businesses, and specifically how government can engage with industry. And this has been going on for a while now, and part of what we'll discuss here is what our findings have been. And I think the report should be published sometime by the end of this month or early next month, for those of you who are interested. Anyway, so the idea here was to just introduce blockchain, look at the basics, what's a consensus mechanism, what are smart contracts, which is where for me I see a lot of value. And this is one of the few areas where I see us being able to use blockchain even as network operators. What are the benefits? Some network operator use cases, evaluate some offers and generally get some feedback from the audience to see if we can improve on what we have done so far, okay? So blockchain is typically just a distributed ledger. And we've seen quite a number of these implementations before blockchain came along. But generally, you can either have one copy of something or multiple copies of something, okay? And the general idea here is that all parties would reconcile the database with a centralized electronic ledger that's maintained by a central body. In the case of a centralized ledger, in a distributed ledger, everybody has access to this data. Everybody at the same time can see if any changes are made, and all the compute nodes, for lack of a better word, would have to agree before they commit anything to the ledger. And in there, we have another concept of a permissioned and a permissionless ledger. So the most common one people understand, for instance, is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is probably one of the most common implementations of blockchain as a technology. And that one is permissionless. You might have others that you need to be allowed in for you to participate. And here we show you a few examples of public permissionless like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and we have others that are permission like Sovereign. And of course, there's private permission and private permission, things like Hyperledger, Sawtooth, that's being used a lot by guys like Intel, IBM, and the like. So generally, a blockchain or a distributed ledger can either be public or private, permissioned or permissionless, and the access type could either be public to everyone or restricted to a few, as in the case of, for instance, a government entity offering passports. They would want to validate who's on the blockchain in this case. Okay. So a consensus mechanism here is a process in which a majority of all network validators come to some sort of agreement, okay? So if the general idea here is there's a set of rules and procedures that we all agree to, and then there's a coherent set of facts between all those participating, okay? Again, one of the things you notice, if I was to use the most, again, common one, for instance, blockchain, for each transaction, everyone around the world that's on the blockchain has to agree that this transaction has taken place. And once it has taken place, there's no way to erase it, or there's no way to modify it at all. So if you look at some of the technologies employed, or some of the consensus mechanisms employed, we have something we call proof of work. We have proof of stake, and majority voting, and I suspect over time there will be a couple more. Okay, and lastly, I think here is for me the most exciting one. A smart contract is a collection of code and data, which could be referred to as functions and states, if you're writing the application, that is deployed to a blockchain, okay? And the idea here, the smart contract is what allows us to fully automate some of these functions. If you think about applying for a passport, from the moment you click send all your details to, let's say, an immigration department, beyond that, the expectation is that the system will automatically check all your details and in the end actually just tell you where to go collect your passport, automatically actually get it shipped to you. Okay? So this is deployed to a blockchain, and future transactions after the initial agreement is done should be done completely on-chain. The idea here is there should be as little interference from human beings or from people as possible. The key benefits we are looking at here is that each party on a blockchain has access to the entire database. This reduces a lot of fraud, for instance. It makes you think through a process initially. No single party controls the data end to end, and everybody can verify the records of its transaction partners directly. So the idea here is to bring trust in a trusted environment, if that makes sense. Okay, so parties who traditionally would not have worked together without going through legal contracts and a lot of documents would have an opportunity for once to speed things up on a blockchain. The transmission is peer-to-peer. And in this case, the communication here occurs directly between peers instead of through a central node. Okay. Again, this speaks a lot to decentralization for us, as far as you're concerned. Again, from a technical perspective, we have transparency, which is what we are looking for. There's a lot of transparency built into blockchain. The general idea here is that anybody who's participating should be able to see exactly what's happening. And this tends to stop a lot of mischief when there's transparency. So every transaction and associated values are visible to everyone with access to the system. Each node or user on a blockchain has an alphanumeric address that identifies them. And you can choose to either remain anonymous in this case or provide proof of identity. Now, this particular sentence depends a lot on what you're implementing and how you want to implement it, okay? But the key thing here is we also have this irreversibility of records. You cannot go in and delete a record, okay? And if you do, it actually invalidates either that record or the entire chain, and you'd have to either start another one or nullify everything that has happened before that, okay? So everything put in is permanently in there. And obviously this poses its own challenges when you start looking at some of the use cases. You know, for how long should you store this data? How many records should we be able to go back to? There's quite a number of things to start considering here. In terms of use cases, I think the first and most known use case as far as blockchain is concerned is cryptocurrencies, specifically Bitcoin. Ethereum followed quite closely, and today we have quite a number of cryptocurrencies. By design, as a task force, we avoided discussing cryptocurrencies quite a bit because obviously then it gets in the way of the conversation as far as we are concerned. Second generation, we are looking at distributed ledger technologies, put assets into the blockchain. This could be land, property, medical records, etc., etc. So one of the most popular distributed ledger technology, at least that we've seen employed on our side, is how we issue our driving licenses, as an example. The new generation licenses are all being put on top of a DLT. The other thing I think we're also looking at is how we do IDs, identity services. Again, this will probably be on a DLT on our side. And we are talking to quite a number of entities around Africa, and I think a few guys in Europe who are looking at or assisting us in making some of these implementations happen. Within Cisco, we also have quite a number of implementations, especially around asset management, how we handle our stock, manufacturing, and things like this. Smart contracts is where we seem to be right now. So if land and money and IDs can be put on a distributed ledger, then it makes sense to start swapping them on the chain in one manner or the other. And then, of course, if smart contracts are happening, then we can actually go in and match sellers and buyers. I'm selling mangoes. You have a truck, go pick them. The smart contract will automatically execute and pay you. I don't have to get in there. If you pick 10 boxes from my farm, it should automatically pay you for whatever you picked, and on and on and on. There should be as little human intervention as possible. I know of a company in Kenya, for instance, looking at how to do this with standard wireless access points, as an example. Throw them on a blockchain, meter how much everyone is using, automatically pay the operators, or the bandwidth operator in this case, automatically pay whoever offered the access points, and on and on and on. Which I found quite interesting, because for once, we have a use case that directly touching on an area I'm very passionate about, networking. So some of the new things we're expecting out of this is, obviously, we haven't exhausted the use cases. We expect some new services and products. So there are many, many areas, from trading assets, tracking, managing supply chain, managing identity, and in providing other services, the software itself. So in agriculture, as an example, we have companies that are partnering. I know IBM is a very big player here. Partnering with IBM, and they are putting a lot of their agricultural systems and value chains on a blockchain. In real estate, there's quite a lot happening again in real estate, with the idea of what if we're able to tokenize some of these physical assets, as an example. So today, you would go to a bank, pay for a mortgage, for an entire house, and you're paying for your entire life for this thing. What if you could tokenize this, and 10 of us could own that house, as an example? So there are interesting things happening in that area. For land, for example, I mean, in land would definitely, in Africa, you find that land is probably one of the most corrupted areas. And if technology can step in to assist, then I think we should start using it. And of course, there's general business, healthcare, among all others. But I think the key question for this forum is, where are the opportunities for network operators or networkers or people interested around networking? So we have, obviously, infrastructure, which you've already laid out. We have things like access networks, which again, you're already laying out. And like I mentioned, I'm actually working very closely with a few startups right now who are looking at how to try and utilize some of these technologies in the access area. But the key areas where we know for sure that blockchain can play a role, we've circled that in green, is in things like reporting and analytics, customer management, partner management, enterprise management, network management, and of course, in the core operations. Yeah. So specifically, when you think of managed services, I think that's one area where you can benefit quite a bit from using some of these technologies. So this is where we are. So you could implement, for instance, blockchain for data and value exchange within and between networks to reduce fraud. One of the key areas, if you're running critical systems, as an example, how do I trust that the logs generated from this system have not been altered? Okay. So one of the things you could do, for instance, is dump or figure out a way to put all those as they are generated on a chain of several trusted or interested parties, as an example. All right. Identity as a service, this is something we are looking at very closely. Before we do, we believe that for us to create and expand some of these small markets that we have, if you look at East Africa as an example, we have, each country probably has 50 to 60, 70 million odd people. But if you're going to create a big digital market out of these populations, you need to combine this market and figure out how to ship goods across the market, order goods across this entire market. So identity is very key in this process. So for operators, for instance, you're looking at using eSIM solutions and identity and authentication services cryptographically, and this can be done on the blockchain. 5G enablement, obviously here there are quite a number of new opportunities, but the idea is to look at new generation access technologies. And here we believe that if you can have a common platform that everybody agrees on and is able to use, and we can track, meter, and give proper attribution, then we believe some blockchain or some use of these technologies could be able to facilitate this. And of course, there's IoT. The use cases for IoT sort of speak for themselves. You have a bunch of devices out there sending data. How do you trust that the data is coming from that specific device and it has not been altered? Okay. And if these devices are talking to each other, if my fridge wants to order milk because it ran out of milk, can it actually pay for this milk? You know, if we can enable some of these things, then it's, I think, I see very interesting things coming out of this particular area. Anyway, so if you're going to evaluate this, you need to look at this from a technical perspective. Obviously, there's a whole business framework that you need to look at, but more importantly, there's a governance framework that we are currently, we seem to have started with, at least for some of these markets. And by some of these markets, I know for sure Uganda is looking at this from a governance perspective. I know Rwanda is looking at this from a governance perspective. And I know Kenya has already started doing some interesting work in these areas. I have not interacted a lot with the Tanzanian market to understand what they are doing. But if someone here has an idea, I'll be more than happy to take this. And yeah, I won't go too much into how the governance works, but I'll mention that you have to align your incentives. So if 4 of you or 5 of you come together to build a network, I don't know, you want to start an MPNO, and you agree that each of us will provide a node, there has to be a way that you align all your incentives to make sure that by the time you execute these smart contracts, everybody is happy with what's going on, okay? There has to be accountability, which hopefully is technically driven. That means all the data that you're collecting about your users, all the money that's being made, everybody needs to see what's going on. And of course, there are decision rights. And as much as possible in this case, you want to avoid any centralization as possible, okay? This has a huge impact. It impacts your consensus mechanisms and how you write your smart contracts. To focus a little bit on the governance, this describes the entity that's responsible for deciding who will be participating nodes or agencies. For most governments, for instance, there's a central body that's required, for instance, to issue identity cards, okay? And for the most part, that's the body that will decide who can participate. So as an example, most immigration departments need access to this data, but they should not be able to change this data just because they have access to it, but they should be notified if there's a change, as an example. So quite often, this would be the lead agency or department mandated to provide a particular service. So for instance, for land registration, you have a land registrar who can make changes to a land's document. these documents or data centers might be what you are running, but the people mandated to make changes to them should be authorized in one form or another. But once those changes are made, there's probably 10 or so agencies that need to be immediately notified that a change has happened. Okay. Ideally, after this is done, after you've agreed on how these changes will be made, they are put on a smart contract. Beyond that, honestly, we don't see why any person should be involved in that transaction. I should be able to come in, click a box, say I'm transferring my land from person A to B, and this should be automatically executed. Okay, so the day-to-day functions should be completely automated. And if you're looking at this closely, some of the bigger impacts from a network operation perspective is probably going to be in your data centers. How do you design these things to manage these new workflows, etc., etc. In terms of approaches, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but there's the traditional client-server implementations that governments and network operators and people have generally implemented from an organization's perspective. So you have just an organization and their systems. What we are looking at now is being able to introduce distribution ledgers. And here several nodes are operated by different agencies to deliver the decentralized nature of these ledgers, okay? It resembles a network structure of sorts, and the organization is responsible for services that get provisioned on the ledgers, and it looks something like this, okay? In the future, what we are hoping is something like this, where all organizations talk to one big distributed ledger in a completely decentralized manner. That's the future we are hoping for, where everything or as many things get automated as possible. I think one of the few countries I've seen do this quite successfully is Estonia. If you go to Estonia, at least so far as I've seen, and in all the workshops and in everything that they've come and shown us, they are digital first as a government. That means they figured out the infrastructure, they figured out the systems, they figured out the governance systems, they've sorted out most of the issues that we would have to go through to get to that point. Yeah, and this is what it looks like. And generally, what you would have is different ministries, agencies, network operators, etc., etc., coming together, agreeing on exactly what they want to achieve, and starting to make the implementations happen. This is mainly a reference or a repeat of pretty much everything we've been discussing. How do you do the decision rights? How do you do the accountability? And how do you align the incentives? But I think in closing, from a technological perspective, for both blockchain and AI, one of the key areas, at least everybody is very aware right now. So if you're working, for instance, in cybersecurity space, a lot of AI is being employed for anomaly detection and a whole host of other functions. Ideally, blockchain should not really be visible to the users, but to anyone running a critical service that needs to use it, especially if you're running it between multiple parties. I think there's something in there that can be, that you could utilize blockchain for. But yeah, beyond that, it's a nice topic to start looking into and trying to figure out if there's something you can start getting value out of. Okay, I believe that should be the last slide on this deck. If anyone has any questions? Apart from honest. Oh, it's okay.
So from an infrastructural standpoint, what role do you see service providers playing within this blockchain ecosystem?
So it depends, right? So at least so far what we are, so there are two things. First of all, this will bring on board new use cases. Some we've not discussed or defined. We don't know if this has a So if I think of when you are looking at something like land records is a good example. The first discussion was, are you going to scan all these records and after each change, I mean, how many records do you need to store, for instance? There's a huge impact on storage if you're going to do it this way. There's things around the distributed nature of blockchains. What impact does it have to the network designs that we are doing today? Do we need to change something? Do we need to implement something differently? So the nature of the blockchain in itself, by design, might call for changes, assuming some people find this deficient, or it might be okay with what you're doing, but for sure we know from a provisioning perspective, capacity and things like this, then there might be an impact. But I think outside of this, where I see an opportunity also is this collaborative nature of building networks might actually be possible. I'll bring a node, you bring a node, someone else brings a node, and let's run a network. You know, this might also be possible. So there are several use cases and impacts that need to be evaluated depending on what you're looking at.
Hi, I'm Harry from Capital Technologies. Thank you for your presentation. It's basically new here as well. It took me a while to differentiate between Bitcoin and blockchain, the two different things.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, I just want to know, you've worked with the governments in, you mentioned Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya as well. How receptive are they to implementing blockchain as a means of technology, according to your research? Are they very receptive or not yet?
Yeah, and surprisingly quite. Kenya has a task force that's generating a report right now, and most of the recommendations have been very well received. I think Uganda launched a task force probably around the last 3 to 4 months, if I'm not wrong. In Rwanda specifically, they had a whole event around blockchain. And what was surprising was even central bank governors were coming and saying, you know what, this is something we need to look into. Obviously, we need to be careful, etc., etc. But all of them are actually embracing it, especially when it comes to things like how do we, so there are key opportunities for them, like how do we ship goods from the port of Mombasa, for instance, all through to these landlocked countries while keeping the times they take at border points shorter, for instance. That's something we are looking at. There's a discussion around a single digital market right now around most of the East African countries. You can't do this without identity. The question is, how do you build these identity services in a way that is trusted by everyone, for instance? So it's, for me, as far as I'm concerned, it's been quite well received by people I didn't expect to actually receive it, so long as you don't discuss crypto.
The second question is, we're moving from the accustomed model of hierarchy centralization to peer-to-peer. I'm a bit concerned with the security aspect of it, especially when you're doing critical things like issuing of passport, driving licenses. So is it an advisable method of going peer-to-peer for mission-critical applications, basically on the network side and also on the government side? That's a query as well.
I think this is more a question of design. I would leave it to the guys. It's up to us, obviously, to advise. And I'm not saying we know everything there is to know around how you design a secure system, but it's one of those areas that's being looked at very closely, like the security of blockchain. For that particular use case, for instance, there has to be an entity that's mandated with regulating the actual issuance. But once you issued a passport, for instance, how many times do you change it? I don't believe, I mean, it sounds complex, but if you think about it, it's the issuance of these passports and changes that we need to track. The idea here is, yes, we would have to take into consideration a lot of these issues, but I don't think it should stop us from at least starting to look at how we can utilize the technologies to make things better for everyone.
Thanks, John, for this very interesting presentation. My question or rather comment would be, so beyond the technical aspect of blockchain, I think there is the whole world of like, what's the governance model of a blockchain that perhaps governments and other bodies should be looking into. So is this the question that usually comes when you go and talk about blockchains with government? Like, what's the governance model that they need to put in place to manage those type of things? Should it, for example, be backed by regulation? Something like that.
In the end, look, it's as just a technology, right? I mean, how do you? It's hard to say let's regulate blockchain because each use case is already regulated. If you think about the financial sector as an example, they already have regulations for this. So it's just a technology that you're choosing to start using to enable your business. So I don't see a case where we should be regulating blockchain, but I believe some of the use cases and some sectors that might be impacted by starting to go and using blockchain, regulators should start looking into. But I don't think you should go out and start regulating. What we've done, however, is we are taking this opportunity to recommend things like sandbox regulations for some of these new technologies. As far as I'm concerned, I believe AI will probably have a bigger impact than blockchain in itself. And it's an area I don't believe we are having the right conversations. For blockchain, I think anything that needs to be regulated is already regulated. If you want to do a cryptocurrency as an example, there's already a body that's mandated to do money, you know. But for everything else, people are using blockchain every day. You don't need to. I personally, I'm very anti-regulation where it doesn't need to be.
Pamela from TechChicks. I have a question. What is the starting point for an organization? Where do you start?
Well, you start by evaluating what it is you do and what blockchain is, and if there are any tangible benefits to using it. So if you're doing, for instance, if you're in a company that's doing a lot of supply chain management, as an example, then blockchain is a definite hit for you. For me personally, I'm really looking at how can we have critical systems logs, for instance, put on a blockchain in a way that people are happy that they won't be edited or changed after they are written, after they come out of the applications or whatever it is they're coming from. So it really varies from organization to organization. But what I would tell anyone who's interested in blockchain is to start educating themselves on blockchain. If you're training, maybe run some hackathons or train people on the same way we teach people how to run DNS. We should train people on what blockchain is. Then they can start evaluating for themselves if they need to use it.
Thank you. Maybe just an addition. In Tanzania, we also have head of the blockchain community, which is trying to create awareness.
Oh, excellent. Let me know. I'm organizing quite a number of trainings around blockchain. So.
All right, Harry again. Yesterday, I'm building upon a workshop we had, not workshop, session we had. Are we sending too much money to Europe? We're using platforms based on like the smart contracts platform. You gave an example of is it Ethereum? Yeah. Do you have any platforms coming from Africa for Africa, or we're still based? We're still dependent on the already established platforms already there.
I know quite a number of applications written in Africa actually for blockchain or based on blockchain. But like I said, again, in the end, each entity is evaluating whether to use the technology or not based on their needs. If you understand the technology and you can build an application, then I think you should. But for the most part, we have quite interesting use cases and applications coming out of Africa. Some of the biggest ones are actually being done by government, which surprises me quite a bit. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Stanley here. Yes, I think I remember. I think you said I think the requirements for blockchain. I think proof of
Work or stake.
proof
Yeah.
of stake.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for a very practical example, like I said about passports. If I go and I apply for a passport,
Yes.
perhaps what I'm thinking is that proof of work is the application. If what I'm thinking about, and a proof of stake would be like I'm a stakeholder, and wherever I'm trying to is also a stakeholder. This, if I'm understanding correctly. But to get to know how blockchain is working for me in that process, just out of curiosity, I'm just a basic guy. I'm not technical at all. So how will I be able to know that out of that process and blockchain applications that when I go and get my a passport that it won't fail, it's genuine, stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay. So, first of all, in a properly implemented, fully automated system, the first thing you'll notice is speed. You should be able to get your passport in hours, ideally, as opposed to the length of time it takes. I don't know how long it takes in Tanzania, but in Kenya, you can get your passport probably in about 5 to 14 days, if I'm not wrong. This should be reduced to hours because the systems know. If you look at all the details that you're putting in to get your passport, several government agencies already have them. So if these government agencies are part of nodes that are seated on a blockchain, with of course the immigration or whoever issues passports being the main issuer of this document, then it should be very quick. You should be able to quickly validate, I was born here based on one of the nodes. I should be able to validate that I have an ID here, assuming that's a requirement. You should be able to validate my parents' details. This should not take long in a system that already works. So the first thing you'll notice as a citizen is speed. As far as I'm concerned, a citizen should not know what technology is implemented at the back. But the efficiencies that come with using this system should make it inherently faster to issue some of these documents or to resolve some of these issues for a citizen. So I think that's a key thing from a complete layman that should be noticed. Of course, if they have to explain how are you doing this, then we can say, yeah, we're implementing blockchain to ensure that it's safe, it's secure, it's immutable. Once this document is issued to you, nobody can change the details in the system unless they issue with a new one, etc., etc.
This is Wilfred from Internet Solutions. Now, assuming, and the active word being assuming you work with operators.
Yeah.
There should be some minimum security features that each needs to observe.
Probably.
Have you started defining that and just giving out as a pre-qualification? Because networks keep evolving every time. There's things that you need to look at.
No, we've not gone that far.
Uh-huh.
Ideally, I would expect each country would have like minimum standards for hosting specific types of data.
Yes.
Like what kind of data center should you host? I don't know.
Including also the access network.
Yeah, exactly. because when we are discussing this, for instance, does it mean all these MDAs go and start building a bunch of data centers? I don't think so. They have to come to operators to do this. So, but in terms of have we given this, remember, I still work for a vendor. There are things I can't go in and start saying, you must. Otherwise, all of you will be on Cisco networks. So, no, we've not gone that far. Thank you.
Thank you very much.